I don't talk much, mister. The woman's voice was flat, steady. But I can cook. Silas Crane looked up from the notice he'd just posted. She stood in the dust outside Henderson's store, a worn carpet bag at her feet. 200 pounds? Easy. Maybe more. Her dress was plain, faded at the seams. Her shoes were caked with road dirt. He almost laughed. Would have. If her eyes hadn't stopped him cold. She wasn't begging, wasn't explaining, just standing there, chin level, waiting for him to catch up. Behind her, two men by the horse trough snickered. Something crude, something about appetites. She didn't flinch. Silas's hand hovered over his tobacco tin. The notice behind him, cook wanted. Hard work. Isolated, had drawn no one worth considering all morning. You got references? No. Family? No. His hand dropped. Get in the wagon. Her bag was in her grip before he finished speaking. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've been enjoying these frontier stories, consider subscribing. It helps us keep bringing you more tales from the Old West. The wagon creaked up the mountain road for 2 hours. Neither of them spoke. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers pressed against the rough wool of her skirt. The man beside her, Crane, the store clerk had called him, handled the reins with the ease of someone who'd made this journey 1,000 times before. 40, maybe older. Hard to tell with men who lived alone in high country. His beard was shot through with gray, his shoulders broad under a faded canvas coat. The road narrowed. Pines crowded close, their shadows cutting the afternoon light into ribbons. Clara breathed deep. Sap, dust, horse sweat. Different from town. Cleaner, somehow. She didn't ask where they were going. The posting had said isolated. The word hadn't scared her then. Didn't scare her now. Crane glanced at her once quick, like he was checking she hadn't vanished. She kept her eyes forward. The wagon crested a ridge. There it was. A cabin. Log walls gone silver with weather. A porch sagging slightly at one corner. Thin smoke rising from a stone chimney, which meant he'd banked a fire before leaving that morning. Practical man. Beyond the cabin stood a corral with maybe a dozen cattle. A small barn listed to the east. Everything showed the wear of a place, tended by one pair of hands for too many years. Crane pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't move to help her down. Clara didn't wait. She gripped the wagon's edge, lowered herself to the ground, boots sending up small clouds of dust. Her carpet bag followed. The cabin door stood unlocked. She pushed it open. The smell hit first. Rancid grease. Stale ash. Something small had died in a corner weeks ago, and nobody had bothered finding it. The kitchen table was buried under tin cans, a rusted knife, crumbs that had fossilized. The stove was caked black with burnt residue. A pot sat on top, its contents beyond identification. Clara stood in the doorway, taking inventory. Behind her, Crane's boots stopped at the threshold. She could feel him there, watching, waiting to see if she'd turn around and demand the ride back to town. She didn't. Instead, she set her carpet bag by the wall, rolled up her sleeves, and reached for the pot on the stove. Whatever had been inside had once been beans. A long time ago. The sound of hooves reached the cabin 3 weeks into Clara's employment. She was kneading bread dough when the rhythm hit her ears. 2 horses, moving easy up the ridge road. Her hands stilled in the flour. Through the kitchen window, she watched 2 men ride into the clearing. Crane emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. The men dismounted, One was heavy-set, red beard going gray at the edges. The other was younger, leaner, with the kind of face that suggested he found most things amusing. Clara went back to her dough. The screen door banged. Boots crossed the threshold. She didn't turn around. Crane? The older man's voice filled the room. Came to talk about that water rights issue down at the... He stopped. Clara felt his eyes on her back. The weight of his gaze traveled from her shoulders to her hips to the width of her arms working the dough. Well now. The amusement in his voice was thick as molasses. What's this, Clara? Crane's voice came flat, neutral. She cooks? Cleans? I can see she does plenty of eating too, laughed. Clara's hands pressed into the dough. She folded it. Pressed again. The rhythm didn't change. Crane, where'd you find this one? The older man she'd learned his name was Cobb pulled out a chair and sat without being invited. The wood creaked under his weight. Must have been desperate, taking on a... She found me. Crane's voice cut through, not angry, just done. Coffee's on. Sit, or Clara reached for the tin cups on the shelf above the stove. She poured 2 cups, black and steaming, set them on the table without looking at either man. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady, no matter what people said about her. She returned to the stove. The venison stew she'd started that morning was ready. Rich and thick, the meat falling apart, potatoes and carrots from the root cellar swimming in dark gravy. She ladled it into 2 bowls. The biscuits came out of the warming oven golden, steam rising when she set them in a basket lined with a flour sack towel. She placed everything on the table, still didn't look at them. Then she went back to her dough. Heavy on her feet too, Clara kneaded, folded, pressed. The men ate. The cabin fell quiet except for the sound of spoons against tin bowls. Clara worked the dough, feeling it grow smooth and elastic under her palms. Behind her, the rhythm of eating changed, slowed. Cobb's spoon stopped mid-air. She heard him chewing. The sound of it shifted from careless consumption to something else, something more deliberate. He cleared his throat. This is good. Jennings had gone silent. His bowl was already half empty when Clara glanced over her shoulder. His face had lost that smirking edge. He was focused entirely on the food in front of him. Clara shaped the dough into a round and covered it with a cloth. She moved to the counter, pulled out dried apples from a jar, began slicing them for a pie. The knife moved quick and sure, each slice falling in neat rows. The water rights? Crane's voice broke the silence. What's the issue? Cobb seemed to struggle remembering why he'd come. He blinked at his bowl, then up at Crane. Right. The lower creek. Some of my cattle been crossing onto your land to drink. Wanted to make sure we had an understanding. Keep them south of the ridge marker. That's the line. Fair enough. Cobb scraped the last of the stew from his bowl. His eyes drifted to the stove, to Clara's back. She make pie. Clara's knife paused on the cutting board. Dried apple. Tomorrow. It was the first time she'd spoken since they arrived. Both men looked at her, not with the mockery from before, something different now. Harder to name. Tomorrow. Cobb nodded slowly. Might have to ride back up this way tomorrow. Then Jennings was reaching for another biscuit. His third, maybe fourth. The men left an hour later. Clara watched through the window as they mounted their horses. Cobb said something to Jennings. Jennings glanced back at the cabin, then nodded. They rode out. Clara washed the dishes. The water was cold from the pump, her knuckles reddening as she scrubbed. Outside, the light was going amber, shadows stretching long across the clearing. She heard Crane's boots on the porch, heard him pause at the door. He didn't come inside. Clara dried the last dish and set it on the shelf. The kitchen was clean now. Had been clean since her second day here. The counters scrubbed, the floor swept, the windows letting in actual light for the first time in what looked like years. She untied her apron, hung it on its hook by the door. When she walked to her room, the small space at the back of the cabin, just a rope bed and a washstand, she found Crane crouched by the door frame. He had a screwdriver in one hand. A small oil can sat on the floor beside him. He didn't look up, just kept working at the hinges. "Lock was loose," he said. Clara looked at the door. The lock was old iron, the kind that needed a key from both sides. It had worked fine this morning when she'd tested it. Tightened it. Crane stood, slipping the screwdriver into his back pocket. Oiled the hinges, too. Won't squeak now. He walked past her toward the main room. Didn't wait for thanks. Didn't seem to expect any. Clara stood in the doorway of her small room, looking at the lock. She reached out and touched the iron. Solid, secure. The mechanism moved smooth and silent when she turned it. She thought about Cobb's eyes on her back, Jennings's laugh. She thought about Crane, who hadn't laughed, who hadn't said a word to defend her, but who was now, in the fading light, reinforcing her through the wall. She heard him settle into the chair by the fire. The creak of wood. Then nothing. Clara closed the door. Turned the lock. It caught smooth and silent. Just like he'd promised. She sat on the edge of her bed. The mattress was corn husks she'd restuffed it herself the first week. The blanket was rough wool, but warm enough. She looked at the locked door. In 26 years, no one had ever thought to make sure she could lock herself in at night. The curtains appeared in the windows 3 days after Clara found muslin at the bottom of a forgotten trunk. Crane didn't say anything about them, but she noticed the way his eyes paused on the white fabric when he came through the door each evening, the way his steps slowed for just a moment before he hung his hat on its hook. She didn't ask if he liked them. The asking wasn't necessary. The weeks settled into rhythm. Clara rose before dawn, started the fire, put coffee on to boil. By the time Crane came in from checking the cattle, breakfast waited on the table, eggs from the 3 hens she'd coaxed back to laying, biscuits golden from the oven, salt pork fried crisp in its own fat. He ate without talking. She didn't mind. The silence between them had lost its edge somewhere in the second week. Now it was just silence. Comfortable. The kind that came from 2 people who had each learned, in their own way, that words weren't always necessary. She found things to fix. The root cellar had fallen into chaos. Crocks of preserved vegetables sat unlabeled. Some spoiled, others still good, but buried under debris and dust. Clara spent 2 full days down there, the cool air pressing against her skin, the smell of earth and damp stone filling her lungs. She found potatoes sprouting pale tendrils, onions gone soft and wet, but also jars of pickles still sound under their wax seals, dried beans in decent condition, a crock of sauerkraut that someone, his wife, maybe had put up years ago. Clara scrubbed the crocks until her arms ached, made labels from paper scraps and a stub of pencil, put everything in order, the good separate from the bad, the usable from the ruin. Crane noticed. She saw him pause at the cellar door one afternoon, looking down the steps at the neat rows of supplies gleaming in the lamplight. "Didn't know half that was down there," he said. Clara was elbow deep in bread dough. "Some of it's still good, the sauerkraut especially." He nodded. Didn't say anything else. But that night, she served the sauerkraut with his dinner, watched him take a bite, chew slowly, swallow. His plate was clean when he pushed back from the table. The herb garden came next. The patch of ground by the kitchen door had surrendered to weeds years ago. But underneath, Clara found the bones of what had once been a proper garden. Sage gone woody. Time struggling through the crabgrass. The skeletal remains of rosemary that might come back with enough water and care. She cleared the weeds on her knees, dirt working deep into the creases of her palms, under her fingernails. The sun warmed her back through the fabric of her dress. Somewhere up the ridge, she could hear Crane's axe steady, rhythmic, splitting wood for the months ahead. She transplanted wild mint she'd found growing by the creek, planted seeds from town dill, parsley, chives, pressing them into the dark soil with her thumb, watered everything from the rain barrel, watching the earth drink. One afternoon, Crane came back from the high pasture with a deer slung across his horse's back. Clara met him at the barn door. "Need help?" He looked at her. Most women would have gone back inside, let him handle the blood and mess of it alone. Clara held out her hand. They strung up the deer together. She held the back legs while he tied the rope, the carcass swinging heavy between them. She steadied it while he reached for his knife. "I can do the rest," he said. "I know how." She took the knife from his hand before he could argue. "My pa taught me. Said every part has use." She made the first cut. Clean. Practiced. The blade found the line between hide and meat like she'd done this 100 times before, because she had. Crane stepped back, watched her work. She skinned the deer in 20 minutes, dressed it in another 15. The organs went into a bucket liver for eating, the rest for bait if Crane set traps. The hide she'd salt later, stretch it on a frame, maybe trade it in town come winter. When she finished, her hands were red to the wrists. Blood spattered her apron, dotted her forearms. She looked up to find Crane still watching. "Your pa," he said slowly. "He raised cattle. Had a small place outside Lincoln, Nebraska territory. He's still there." Clara wiped the knife on her apron. "Fever. 3 winters back," Crane nodded. The kind of nod that meant he understood without needing details. "Your ma?" "Before that, I was 19. She picked up the bucket of offal and carried it toward the edge of the clearing. She'd bury it there, away from the cabin, where it wouldn't draw scavengers. Behind her, she heard Crane follow, his boots in the dirt, the creak of the barn door as he held it open for her. That evening, dinner stretched longer than usual. Clara had made stew from the last of the salt pork, thick with vegetables from her cleaned-out cellar, biscuits, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting shifting shadows across the wall. Crane ate slowly. When his plate was empty, he didn't rise from the table. Clara poured him more coffee, sat back down across from him. The silence held. But it was a different kind, now expectant, almost like the air before a summer storm. "My wife." His voice came rough, like the words had to travel a long way to reach his mouth. "Childbirth. 12 years ago." Clara's hand stilled on her cup. "Baby didn't make it either." She didn't say sorry. The word was useless. She knew that better than most. It changed nothing, fixed nothing, just filled silence with noise. Instead, she rose from her chair, took the coffee pot from the stove, refilled his cup without being asked, then sat back down. Crane looked at her across the table. Something passed through his expression. Not gratitude exactly. Not relief. just recognition. The look of one person seeing another clearly. Maybe for the first time, Clara held his gaze for a moment, then turned to watch the fire burn down. They sat like that until the flames were embers glowing orange in the dark. Neither spoke again. Neither needed to. When Clara finally rose to clear the dishes, she noticed something. Crane's chair had moved. Just an inch, maybe two, closer to the table. Closer to where she'd been sitting in the morning. She found something on the kitchen table that hadn't been there before. A block of applewood, pale gold, the grain tight and fine. And beside it, a whittling knife. The handle worn smooth from years of use. Both placed exactly where she'd see them first when she came to start the fire. Crane came through the door before dawn. His boots hit the floorboards too hard. Wrong kind of hard. Clara looked up from the stove where she was starting the morning coffee. His face was tight, jaw clenched, a muscle jumping near his temple. Dirt stained his trousers at the knees, fresh dirt, dark with dew. He'd been kneeling somewhere. "Coffee," he said. Nothing else. She poured it. Black, steaming, strong enough to strip paint. He took the cup and drank standing, one hand braced against the doorframe. His knuckles had gone white against the wood. "How many?" Clara asked. He looked at her. The question seemed to catch him off guard that she'd known to ask it at all. 5? He set the cup down hard on the table. Coffee sloshed over the rim. Maybe more by now. He was out the door before she could respond. Clara stood at the window, watching him stride toward the barn, his shoulders hunched forward, head down, like a man walking into a wind that wasn't there. She'd seen that posture before, on her father, the morning he'd come in from the pasture with that same look on his face. She finished the breakfast he wouldn't eat, covered the plate with a cloth, put on her work boots, laced them tight, and followed him out. The sick cattle were in the lower pasture, separated from the rest of the herd by a makeshift rope barrier strung between fence posts. Clara stopped at the rail and looked. 5 head. No 6 now. A young heifer had joined the others since Crane had come inside, her legs unsteady beneath her, head hanging low like it weighed too much for her neck to support. The animals moved sluggishly, joints stiff, each step deliberate and pained. One cow stood apart from the rest, sides heaving with labored breath. A thin string of mucus hanging from her muzzle and swaying in the morning breeze. Crane crouched beside her, running his hands along her flank. His movements were careful, methodical, looking for marks, signs of attack, wounds that would explain what was happening. Clara knew he wouldn't find any. The memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome, her father's face in the lamplight, counting losses on his fingers, 30 head in 2 weeks, half their herd, the beginning of the end for their small farm in Nebraska. Though they hadn't known it then, the sound of hooves broke through her thoughts. Horses coming up the ridge road, moving fast. She turned to see Cobb and Jennings riding hard into the clearing, dust rising behind them in a pale cloud. Cobb dismounted before his horse fully stopped, boots hitting the ground at a run. "How bad?" 6. Crane's voice came flat, stripped of everything but the facts. 7 by nightfall, the way it's going? Any marks, wounds? None. Jennings tied off his horse and walked to the barrier. He studied the cattle with narrowed eyes, thumbs hooked in his belt. Could be wolves. Got at 'em at night, spooked 'em into eating something bad. Ain't wolves. Cobb shook his head, beard catching the early light. No marks means no attack. This is something else. Bad feed. Then, Jennings pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair. That grain you got from Miller's last month could have gone moldy sitting in his barn. Grain's fine. Checked it myself. Crane stood from his crouch, knees popping. His face had aged 10 years since yesterday. Checked it twice. Then what? Jennings's voice rose, cracking on the last word. Cattle don't just get sick for no reason. Crane, something's causing this. You think I don't know that? Clara stood at the fence, watching. The men argued in circles. Wolves, feed, disease, the water, the grass, the air itself. Each theory raised, examined, pulled apart, discarded. Their voices grew louder with each pass, frustration bleeding into every word. Crane's voice grew quieter. She watched his hands. The way they hung at his sides, fingers opening and closing, the set of his shoulders, higher than usual, tension coiled there like rope wound too tight around a post. She could see it in every line of his body. This wasn't just about cattle. This was about everything. A small herd, already stretched thin from years of solitary work. Losing even a quarter of it could mean the end. Clara looked at the cattle again. At the way they stood, the heaviness in their movements. Like they were carrying weight that didn't belong to them. The mucus. The stiff joints. The labored breathing. She looked toward the creek. The lower section. Where the bank had collapsed last spring, she'd noticed it on her walks. The pale exposed earth. The way the soil there looked different from the rest. Chalky. Almost dry and crumbling even after rain. Her boots were moving before she'd made the decision. Where's she going? Jennings's voice. Distant now, edged with irritation. She didn't answer. Didn't slow down. The ground sloped away from the pasture toward the creek bed, grass growing shorter and sparser the closer she got. She could see the water through the trees now, a thin ribbon of silver catching the morning light. The bank had given way in two places. Fresh earth exposed, raw as a wound. The soil was pale gray against the darker dirt around it, almost white in patches. Clara crouched at the water's edge. The creek ran clear enough. Nothing obviously wrong on the surface. But the soil. She reached down, scraped her fingers through the chalky residue coating the waterline. Brought her hand to her nose. Sharp. Mineral. Familiar in a way that made her stomach clench. Her tongue touched the edge of her fingernail. Tasted. Spat immediately into the dirt. Alkali. She stood. Her pulse was faster now, but her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. She walked back up the slope, the white residue still coating her fingers. Drying in the morning air, the men had stopped arguing. They watched her approach Cobb with his arms crossed over his chest, Jennings with his hat pushed back, and his face twisted with skepticism. Crane standing apart from both of them, waiting. Clara stopped at the fence. It's the water. The words fell into silence so complete she could hear the sick cattle breathing behind her. Labored, wet, wrong. Cobb's face went through something complicated. Confusion, then doubt, then something that might have been the beginning of belief. What, the lower creek? Clara held up her hand, showing the white residue still clinging to her fingers, caught in the creases of her palm. Alkali. It's seeping through where the bank collapsed. The cattle have been drinking from it. Jennings made a sound in his throat. Not quite a laugh, but close. And how would you know that? Because I watched my pa lose 30 head the same way? The words hung in the air. Clara didn't look away from Cobb's stare. Didn't flinch. Didn't add anything or take anything back. Crane moved first. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, stopped in front of her, looked at her fingers, then at her face. His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for uncertainty. He didn't find any. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "What do we do?" Clara wiped her hand on her apron, leaving a faint white streak on the dark fabric. "Move them away from the lower creek. Now. Don't let any of them near that water. Use the upper spring only. The one's already sick. You treat with molasses and vinegar. 2 cups molasses, 1 cup vinegar, mixed into their feed, forces the alkali through their system faster, binds it up so it can pass." Jennings looked at Cobb. Cobb looked at Clara. "That actually work?" Cobb's voice was still skeptical, but the hostility had drained from it. He was asking now. Actually asking. "It worked for my pa. Lost 30 head, but saved the other 70. Would have lost them all if he hadn't figured it out." Crane was already moving. "Jennings, help me get the rope line moved to the upper pasture. Cobb, ride back to your place and bring whatever molasses you've got. I'll check the upper spring, make sure it's running clean. I've got 2 tins. Cobb was mounting his horse. "Maybe 3? "Bring all of it." The men scattered. Hooves pounded the dirt. Shouts echoed across the clearing. Rope groaned as it was pulled from posts and coiled for moving. Clara stood at the fence, watching the sick cattle. The young heifer that had gone down last was lying flat now, legs folded beneath her body, breathing shallow. Too late for some of them. Maybe. But not all. She walked to the barn, found the vinegar she'd bought in town last week, 3 bottles, meant for pickling cucumbers from a garden she hadn't planted yet. She carried them to the feed trough near the sick cattle and set them in a row. Molasses. They'd need more than Cobb could bring. She'd have to ride to town herself if the cattle were still standing by tomorrow. She found a bucket, measured the ratios in her head, poured the dark, thick molasses first, watching it pool and spread, added the vinegar, the sharp smell cutting through the sweetness like a knife, stirred with a wooden paddle until her arm ached, the mixture turning the color of old rust. The sick heifer lifted her head, watched Clara approach with the bucket. Clara set it down in front of her. The heifer's nostrils flared. She turned her head away. "I know." Clara's voice was low, just for the 2 of them. "Smells like something gone wrong. But it'll help. Trust me." She pushed the bucket closer. The heifer's tongue touched the surface, drew back, then came forward again, lapping slowly at the mixture, each swallow an effort. Clara straightened. Her back ached from crouching. Her hands smelled of vinegar and molasses, the scent clinging to her skin. She looked at the sky. The sun had barely cleared the ridge. The whole day stretched ahead mixing feed, forcing sick cattle to eat, watching for signs of change. Recovery or decline, life or loss. She walked back toward the barn for more buckets. Crane was standing by the door. He'd stopped in the middle of carrying rope, coils hanging from his arm. And now he stood motionless, watching her cross the clearing. Their eyes met. He nodded. Once, slow and deliberate. The kind of nod that carried weight, that said things words couldn't. Then he turned and went back to his work. Clara filled another bucket, mixed another batch. The vinegar bit at a small cut on her palm she hadn't noticed before, a sharp sting that faded to a steady burn as she worked. By midday, 3 more cattle had gone down, but the first heifer, the one Clara had treated earliest, was standing again, walking, even, slowly, unsteadily. but walking. Clara leaned against the fence, watching her take one trembling step, then another. Her arms ached. Her apron was stained beyond saving. Sweat had dried salt white on her forehead. The heifer reached the water trough, the clean one, filled from the upper spring, and drank. Behind Clara, Cobb's horse came up the ridge. Saddlebags heavy with molasses tins. The cattle recovered. Not all of them. 2 heifers didn't make it through the first night. Their bodies too far gone by the time Clara's remedy reached them. An older cow followed by mourning. Her breathing stopped sometime in the dark hours while everyone slept. But the rest pulled through. Clara watched the change happen over the following 2 weeks. One by one, the animals found their legs again. The stiffness left their joints. They started eating with appetite instead of obligation. Started moving with something other than that terrible, sluggish weight that had gripped them before. She kept mixing the molasses and vinegar, kept checking the water supply from the upper spring, kept walking the fence line to make sure no cattle had wandered back toward the contaminated creek. The work was steady and consuming, leaving her little time to think about anything else. Crane worked alongside her when he could. They didn't talk much, they never did, but the silence between them had shifted again. Grown warmer somehow. More comfortable. On the 14th day, Clara stood at the fence and counted heads. All present, all standing, all moving through the grass with the easy rhythm of healthy animals. Crane appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him approach. "They're good," he said. Clara nodded. "They're good." He stood there for a moment longer, looking at the herd. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. And something in his shoulders had finally loosened a tension that had lived there since that first morning when he'd come through the door with dirt on his knees and fear in his eyes. Word spread. Clara didn't know how she hadn't told anyone, and Crane wasn't the talking type. But Cobb had a mouth on him. She'd learned that much, and within days of the crisis passing, ranchers started showing up at the ridge. The first was a man named Dawson, thin as a fence post with eyes that couldn't quite settle anywhere. He rode up on a Tuesday morning, hat already in his hands before he dismounted. "Ma'am?" He twisted the hat brim, worrying the felt between his fingers. "Cobb said that you knew something about what's been hitting the herds around here." Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, her hands wet from the wash basin. She wiped them on her apron. "Where do your cattle drink?" "Creek that runs through my lower pasture. Same one feeds into Crane's land. I think." "Check the banks. Anywhere the soil's gone pale and chalky, that's alkali seeping up from below. The rains this spring probably shifted things underground." Dawson's brow furrowed. "And if I find it, move your cattle away, don't let them near that section of water. The ones already showing sick, you treat with molasses and vinegar. 2 parts molasses to 1 part vinegar, mixed into their feed twice a day. That really work." Clara thought of the heifer that had been first to go down, first to stand back up. She was out there now, grazing with the others. No trace of her ordeal except a slight thinness that would fill out with time and good grass. "It works." Dawson left with directions to the general store in town where he could buy molasses by the tin. The next day, another rancher came. Then another after that. Clara answered each of them the same way. Direct, no flourish, no false modesty, but no boasting either. She told them what she knew, admitted when she didn't know something, and sent them on their way with practical steps they could take. "That I can't help you with." She told one man whose cattle were showing different symptoms, fever and bloody discharge, instead of the stiffness and lethargy of alkali poisoning. "You'd need a real animal doctor for that. Someone from Denver, maybe The man had looked disappointed, but he'd nodded and ridden off without argument. The honesty seemed to earn her more respect than any pretended expertise could have. Crane watched all of it. She noticed him noticing. The way he'd pause in his work when a visitor arrived, setting down whatever tool was in his hand, tracking the exchange from a distance. He never interrupted, never inserted himself. But afterward, when the rancher had ridden off and Clara had returned to her tasks, she'd sometimes catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. One evening, after a rancher named Hollis had left with thanks and instructions for treating his own alkali-sick cattle, Crane spoke up. "You could charge them." Clara looked up from the potatoes she was peeling. "For what you know?" He was cleaning his rifle at the table, the same ritual he performed every few days, movements slow and methodical as he ran the oiled cloth down the barrel. The advice? "It's worth something." "It's just what my pa taught me." "Still worth something." Clara considered this. The potato in her hand was rough-skinned, dirt clinging to the eyes where the peel was thickest. She dug the tip of her knife in, carved out a dark spot. Let the silence stretch. "My pa never charged anyone," she said finally. "Said what he knew wasn't really his. Said it came from his pa, and his pa's pa before that. Just gets passed along." Crane didn't respond right away. He ran the oiled cloth down the barrel again, the metal gleaming in the lamplight. "Then your pa sounds like he was a good man." "He was." The fire crackled. Outside, the last light was bleeding from the sky, leaving behind the deep blue of mountain dusk. Clara finished the potatoes, dropped them into the pot, set it on the stove to boil. When she turned around, Crane was watching her. Not with the sidelong glances she'd grown used to, quick looks that darted away the moment she noticed them. This was direct, open. His eyes met hers and held. "What?" she asked. He shook his head, went back to his rifle, but the look stayed with her through dinner, through the washing up, through the quiet hours by the fire while he carved and she mended a tear in her work dress. It felt different from the way men usually looked at her, not calculating her weight, not dismissing her, not making jokes at her expense, just seeing her. She didn't know what to do with that. Later that night, lying in her small room with the door locked and the moonlight coming thin through the single window, Clara thought about belonging, about what it meant, about whether she'd ever felt it anywhere before. She couldn't remember a time, not with her family. Her mother had always looked at her like a disappointment, her sisters like a burden. Not in the towns she'd passed through since, taking work where she could find it, moving on before anyone could decide she'd overstayed. But here, on this mountain, in this cabin, with its muslin curtains and its herb garden and its silence that had stopped feeling empty. Maybe. She fell asleep without finishing the thought. In the morning, she found something on the kitchen table. A spoon, wooden, hand-carved, the handle smooth and slightly curved to fit a palm. The bowl was perfectly rounded, sanded so fine that when Clara ran her thumb across the surface, it felt like touching water. She picked it up, turned it over. The grain of the wood caught the early light apple wood. She realized. From the block he'd left on her table weeks ago, the one she'd never touched because she didn't know what to make with it, he'd known. Crane was already outside. She could hear him in the barn. The sound of hay being forked, animals being fed. He wasn't waiting to see her reaction. Wasn't expecting thanks or praise or anything at all. He'd just made something, left it where she'd find it, and gone back to work. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the spoon in her hand. It was warm already from her grip, the wood soft and alive under her finger. She opened the drawer where the other utensils lived, mismatched tin forks, wooden spoons worn thin from years of stirring, a ladle with a bent handle that nobody had ever bothered to fix. She placed the new spoon among them, then closed the drawer, then opened it again, looked at the spoon sitting there, nestled against the others. It belonged. She started breakfast. The morning passed. Cobb rode up with news that Dawson's cattle were improving. The molasses treatment was working, just like Clara had said. Crane went to check the fence line on the north ridge, where recent rains had loosened some posts. Clara swept the porch, beat the rugs, started bread dough that would rise through the afternoon. Ordinary things. The rhythm of a life she hadn't known she was building until it was already built. By late afternoon, the bread was baked and cooling on the counter, filling the cabin with its warm yeast smell. Clara decided to ride into town for supplies, flour running low, salt nearly out, and she wanted more vinegar just in case another rancher came asking. She saddled the horse herself, the way Crane had taught her, checked the cinch twice, the way he'd shown her, mounted with only a little awkwardness, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins in her hands. The ride down the mountain was familiar now. She'd made it twice before, once for regular supplies, once for the molasses during the crisis. The horse knew the way, picking its path along the ridge road without needing much guidance. Clara let her mind drift. The spoon in the drawer, the way Crane had looked at her last night, the ranchers who came to ask her advice, treating her words like they mattered. She was still thinking about it when she reached town. The bell above the entrance jangled. Two women near the fabric bolts looked up from their conversation. Their mouths stopped moving mid-word. Clara recognized them vaguely, townswomen she'd seen before on her previous trips. Wives of shopkeepers or clerks or somebody. Ordinary women in ordinary dresses, bonnets tied under their chins, hands resting on bolts of calico. They watched her cross to the counter. Their eyes tracked her body, her size, her plain dress, the dust on her hem from the mountain road. She gathered her supplies: flour, salt, vinegar, a new ball of thread, since she had a proper sewing box now to keep it in. Set everything on the counter for the clerk to tally. Behind her, the women started talking again. Quieter this time, but the store was small, and sound carried. The fat one. Yes, lives up on Crane's Ridge now, with the Mountainman alone. Can you imagine what kind of woman does that? Clara's hand tightened on the flour sack. Must be desperate. Or shameless. Pick whichever suits. I heard she came from nowhere. No family. No references. Just showed up and he took her in. Well, a laugh. Thin and knowing. We can guess why. The warmth in Clara's chest went cold. Clara paid for her supplies without looking at the clerk. Her hands moved on their own, counting out coins, accepting the wrapped parcels, tucking them under her arm. The voices behind her had stopped, but she could feel the women's eyes on her back. Hot. Knowing. The same way her sisters used to look at her when she walked into a room. She walked to the door. Her legs felt strange beneath her, like they belonged to someone else. The bell jangled when she pushed through, and the sound seemed too loud, too bright, for the gray fog that had settled over everything. The horse was where she'd left it. She loaded the supplies into the saddlebags, fingers fumbling with the buckles. A simple task she'd done a dozen times, but now her hands wouldn't cooperate. The leather strap slipped. She tried again, slipped again. A group of men walked past on the wooden sidewalk. One of them glanced at her, a quick look, up and down, the kind that measured and dismissed in the same instant. He said something to his companions. They laughed. Clara's face burned. She mounted the horse too fast, nearly losing her balance, grabbing the saddle horn with both hands to steady herself. The animal shifted beneath her, sensing something wrong. She gathered the reins and turned toward the mountain road. The ride back was longer than the ride down. It shouldn't have been. The distance was the same. The horse moved at the same pace. But every step seemed to take twice as long. And the voices in her head wouldn't stop. What kind of woman does that? Desperate or shameless? We can guess why. Her mother's voice joined them, rising up from somewhere she'd thought she'd buried years ago. You always were too much, Clara. Too big. Too slow. Too strange. Her sister's laughter, high and cruel. The way they'd look at each other across the dinner table when she reached for a second helping. The whispered jokes she wasn't supposed to hear but always did. No man will ever want you. Best make yourself useful. It's all you've got. The horse climbed the ridge road. Clara didn't guide it. Didn't need to. Home. The word tasted wrong now. Bitter. Like something spoiled. She'd been fooling herself. All these weeks, the curtains, the garden, the carved spoon, and the townswomen knew better. They saw what she was too stupid to see. A fat woman. A desperate woman. A woman with no family. No references. No place in the world, except what she could barter with her usefulness. Or worse. Clara's stomach turned. She pulled the horse to a stop, leaned over the saddle, and retched into the dirt. Nothing came up. She'd been too distracted to eat breakfast, but her body heaved anyway, rejecting something that couldn't be purged. When it passed, she sat up, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The sun was lower now, throwing long shadows across the road. She'd been riding for hours without noticing. The cabin came into view over the final ridge. Smoke rose from the chimney. The curtain she'd hung caught the late afternoon light. The herb garden was a small patch of green by the door. Everything exactly as she'd left it this morning, when the world still made sense. She dismounted, led the horse to the barn, unsaddled it, brushed it down, forked hay into the stall. The motions were automatic, requiring nothing from her except presence. Crane was on the porch when she came out, sitting in the chair she'd never seen him use before, a piece of wood in his hands, his whittling knife working the grain. He looked up as she approached. Get everything you needed. Clara nodded. Didn't trust her voice. Supper soon. Another nod. She walked past him into the cabin, letting the screen door bang shut behind her. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. The bread cooling on the counter, the pot ready on the stove, the drawer where the carved spoon waited alongside all the others. She unpacked the supplies, flour in the bin, salt in the crock, vinegar lined up on the shelf, where she could find it easily. Her hands moved through the familiar tasks while something inside her went cold and still. She made dinner. Venison stew from the meat she'd helped butcher, vegetables from the cellar she'd organized, biscuits from flour she'd ground herself on the heavy stone mill. She set the table, poured the coffee, called Crane in from the porch. They ate in silence. It was the same silence they'd always shared. The same rhythm of spoons against bowls, the same crackle of the fire, the same absence of unnecessary words. But it felt different now. Hollow. Like something essential had been drained out and replaced with nothing. Crane looked at her twice during the meal. The second time, his brow creased. You all right? Tired? The word came out flat. Long ride. He nodded. Went back to eating. Didn't push. That was the thing about Crane. He never pushed. He waited. He watched. He gave her space to be whatever she needed to be. And she'd mistaken that patience for something else. Something more. After dinner, she washed the dishes while he returned to his carving by the fire. The water was cold from the pump, numbing her fingers, turning them red and stiff. She scrubbed each plate longer than necessary, letting the cold seep into her bones. When the last dish was dry and put away, she stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at the room she'd made hers, the clean counters, the organized shelves, the curtains filtering the firelight into soft gold. "Turning in early," she said. Crane looked up from his carving. She walked to her room, closed the door, turned the lock he'd fixed for her, the one that moved smooth and silent now. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall. The moonlight came through the window, pale and thin. The cabin settled around her, wood creaking as the temperature dropped. Through the wall, she could hear Crane moving the scrape of his chair, the thunk of a log being added to the fire, the quiet rhythm of his evening routine. She should sleep. The day had been long, and tomorrow would be longer. But her mind wouldn't stop circling back to those voices in the store. What kind of woman does that? Her sisters had asked the same question when she'd taken a job at the mill instead of looking for a husband, when she'd learned to butcher hogs from the neighbor's hired man, when she'd done anything at all that didn't fit the shape they thought she should occupy. Too much. Clara, you're always too much. She'd thought she'd escaped that up here, on this mountain, with a man who didn't seem to care how much space she took up. She'd thought it didn't matter what she'd thought. The townswomen had seen the truth, and now she couldn't unsee it. She was useful here. That was all. A cook, a cleaner, a pair of hands that knew how to work when the work ran out, or when someone better came along. She'd be sent on her way just like all the other places she'd passed through. Better to leave now, on her own terms. Before the looks started, before Crane realized what the townswomen already knew, that she didn't belong here, had never belonged here, would never belong anywhere. Clara stood up. Her carpet bag was under the bed, where she'd stored it that first day. She pulled it out, set it on the mattress, opened the worn clasps. The bag gaped at her, empty and waiting. She packed by moonlight. 2 dresses, the ones she'd brought, not the fabric Crane had bought in town. Her mother's brooch, tarnished silver with a chip in the stone, the small amount of money she'd saved from the household budget. Coins wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into the corner of the bag. Her work boots, her spare stockings, the tin of salve she used for her cracked hands. Each item went into the bag like a stone dropped down a well. Heavy, final, disappearing into darkness. The sewing box stayed on the shelf. The carved bird she'd started, never finished, stayed on the bedside table. Everything Crane had given her, everything she'd made here, stayed behind. Those things weren't hers to take. She closed the bag. The clasps clicked in the silence, loud as gunshot. The cabin was quiet now. No movement through the wall. Crane had gone to bed. She waited until she was sure, counted heartbeats, listened for any sound, then eased her door open. The main room was dark except for the dying glow of the fire. She crossed it carefully, avoiding the floorboard that creaked near the kitchen table. The note was harder than the packing. She sat at the table, a stub of candle lit in front of her, a scrap of paper smoothed flat. The pencil felt heavy in her hand. Her fingers left smudges on the page. What could she say? Thank you for hiring me. Thank you for the spoon. The box. The way you looked at me, like I was worth looking at. Thank you for making me think, just for a moment, that I could have something real. She couldn't write any of it. The note, when she finally finished, was simple. I have nothing to give that wasn't already owed for wages. Thank you for the chance. She folded it, wrote Crane on the outside in careful letters. Then she opened the drawer and took out the spoon. The wood was warm from the residual heat of the stove. The handle fit her palm perfectly. One last time. She turned it over, feeling the smooth curve of the bowl, the slight ridges where his knife had shaped the grain. She set it beside the note. The arrangement looked wrong, final, like a grave marker for something that had never quite lived. Clara picked up her bag. The weight of it pulled at her shoulder. Achingly familiar. She walked to the door, put her hand on the latch, looked back one more time at the kitchen she'd made hers. The clean counters, the organized shelves, the spoon lying pale against the dark wood of the table. Then she stepped out into the night and pulled the door closed behind her. The air was cold. Colder than she'd expected. Her breath misted in front of her face as she crossed the yard. Boots crunching softly on the packed earth. The stars were thick overhead, scattered across the sky like spilled salt. She didn't look back at the cabin. If she looked, she wouldn't be able to leave. The road down the mountain was a pale ribbon in the darkness. Clara walked, one foot, then the other. The rhythm of leaving, familiar as her own. The night swallowed her whole. Beat for Part 7. Silas woke to silence. The wrong kind of silence. The cabin was never completely quiet in the mornings. There was always something. The creak of floorboards as Clara moved through the kitchen. The clatter of the stove being stoked. The smell of coffee brewing, drifting under his door like an invitation. None of that now. Just stillness. Heavy and complete. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The first gray light of dawn was seeping through his window, which meant he'd slept later than usual. Clara should have been up for an hour by now. 2, maybe. Something was wrong. He threw back the blanket and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold under his bare feet. He pulled on his trousers, grabbed his shirt, didn't bother buttoning it as he crossed to the door and pulled it open. The main room was dark. The fire had burned down to ash sometime in the night and no one had rekindled it. The kitchen was a wall of shadows, the stove cold, the counter empty. His voice came out rough, thick with sleep. No answer. He walked to her door, knocked once, twice. The sound echoed in the empty cabin. He tried the handle. The door swung open on silent hinges, the hinges he'd oiled himself, weeks ago now, so she could move freely without waking him. The room was empty. Moonlight still lingered in the single window, catching dust motes in the air. The bed was made. Blanket pulled tight across the mattress, pillow arranged with care. The washstand held her basin, her soap, her comb all in place, all untouched. But her carpet bag was gone. Silas stood in the doorway, his mind working slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The sewing box was still on the shelf. The carved bird she'd been working on sat on the bedside table, half finished. Everything else was in its place. Just the bag, just Clara. Gone. He turned and walked back to the main room. His feet carried him to the kitchen table without conscious thought. And that's when he saw it. The note. A folded piece of paper with his name written on the outside in careful letters. And beside it, pale against the dark wood, the spoon he'd carved for her. His hands were shaking when he picked up the note. He didn't notice until the paper trembled in his grip, the words blurring and sharpening as he tried to read them. I have nothing to give that wasn't already owed for wages. Thank you for the chance. He read it twice, 3 times. The words didn't change, didn't explain, didn't tell him what he'd done wrong or why she'd left or where she was going. Gone. The spoon sat on the table like an accusation, like something returned because it had never truly been given, like she'd spent these weeks believing she was borrowing a life that wasn't hers to keep. Silas set down the note. His hands were still shaking. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped rope around his ribs and was pulling it. He looked at the spoon, at the kitchen she'd transformed from a disaster into a home, at the curtains filtering the first real light of dawn, the herb garden visible through the window, all the small marks she'd left on this place. And then he was moving. He didn't remember deciding to go after her. Didn't remember pulling on his boots or grabbing his coat or crossing the yard to the barn. His body knew what to do before his mind caught up. Saddle the horse, tighten the cinch, swing up into the seat. The sky was lightening over the mountains, gray giving way to pale gold. She had a head start. Hours, maybe, depending on when she'd left. But she was on foot. He was on horseback. And there was only one road down the mountain. He kicked the horse into a gallop. The ridge road was a blur beneath him, trees flashing past in the growing light. The cold air cut through his unbuttoned shirt, sharp as a blade. But he didn't feel it. Didn't feel anything except the pounding of hooves and the pressure in his chest. He'd spent 12 years alone. 12 years pushing everyone away, building walls out of silence and distance. After Mary died, after the baby died, he'd told himself it was better this way, easier, safer. No one else to lose, no one else to fail. And then Clara had walked into his life with her worn carpet bag and her 7 quiet words, and everything had shifted. Not all at once, nothing dramatic. Nothing he could point to and say there. That's when it changed. Just a gradual thawing, a slow warming, like spring coming to the mountains after a long, hard winter. He hadn't told her, hadn't known how. The words had been locked up so long he'd forgotten where he'd put the key. And now she was gone because he'd waited too long. The road curved around a shoulder of the mountain, dropping down toward the valley. Silas leaned into the turn, urging the horse faster. The animal's breath came in great plumes of steam, hooves thundering against the packed dirt. Another mile, then another. The sky grew brighter, the first rays of actual sunlight touching the peaks above him. Birds started calling in the trees, the sound foreign after the silence of his frantic ride. And then he saw her. A figure on the road ahead, small and slow-moving, a carpet bag at her feet. She wasn't walking, she was sitting on a boulder by the roadside, her back to him, shoulders hunched forward. She'd stopped. Silas pulled the horse up hard, the animal skidding on the loose dirt. He was off the saddle before it fully stopped, boots hitting the ground, striding toward her with his heart slamming against his ribs. "Clara!" He could see her now, her dress wrinkled from the long walk, her hair coming loose from its pins, her whole body held tight like she was bracing against a blow. Her face, when he circled around to see it, was swollen, red-rimmed eyes. Tear tracks dried on her cheeks. She looked like she'd been crying for hours. She looked wrecked. "I left the accounts on the table?" Her voice was flat, empty. "Paid through the month? I ain't hear about accounts? Then there's nothing to talk about." She reached for her carpet bag, started to rise. "I'll send word when I'm settled. You can forward whatever wages." "Clara. Mr. Crane." "Silas." The word came out rough, urgent. My name is Silas, and you're going to turn around and look at me." She stopped. Her hand was still on the bag, but she'd frozen mid-motion. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was clenched, the rapid rise and fall of her chest. Why'd you leave the spoon? Of all the things he could have asked, of all the questions crowding his throat, fighting to get out, that was the one that made it through. Clara's head dropped. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "It wasn't mine to take. I made it for you. You made it for whoever was there. I was just—" She stopped, swallowed. "I was just useful? That's all I've ever been?" "Who told you that?" She didn't answer, but her shoulders hunched tighter, and something in her face cracked open, just for a second, before she rebuilt the wall. "Town women?" Silas's voice came out hard, not at her, at them. "I heard there's talk. That what this is about, it doesn't matter. It does if it made you run." Clara finally looked at him. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy, every trace of her usual composure stripped away. She looked like someone who'd spent the night destroying herself, piece by... They said, her voice broke. She tried again. "They said I was desperate, shameless, that no proper woman would live alone with a man like you, that there must be something wrong with me." Silas felt his hands curl into fists at his side. "Town women," he said slowly, "sitting in their store with nothing better to do than tear apart anyone different from them, anyone with more guts than they'll ever have." Guts. The word came out sharp, bitter. "Look at me. Really look. This is what I am. This is all I'll ever be." "I am looking." He stepped closer. "Been looking since the day you showed up. Ain't stopped since." Clara shook her head. "Habit, that what you think." He was close enough now to see the individual tears that had dried on her cheeks, the way her hands trembled against the carpet bag. 12 years alone. Clara. Whatever habit was, it died a long time ago. This ain't that. Then what is it? The question hung between them. Morning light was spilling over the ridge now, turning the world gold and rose. Somewhere in the trees, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire. The horse stamped and blew behind him. Silas reached out, slow, giving her time to pull away. His hand closed over hers where it gripped the bag. Her fingers were cold. She'd been out here for hours in nothing but her dress. He felt her trembling, felt the tension running through her like a wire pulled. "I wake up," he said, his voice low and rough. "And the first thing I do is listen for you, in that kitchen, making coffee, humming, while you work." He paused. "I come back from the fields and I smell bread baking and my horse picks up pace because he knows I'm wanting to get home." "You are." Clara's breath caught. "I sit by the fire at night, carving, and all I can think about is how good it feels to have someone there. Not useful, just there." He squeezed her hand. "You think those town women know anything about that missing?" "I'm not." She stopped. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know how to stay. Never learned. Neither do I." He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. 12 years of pushing everyone away. Forgot how to let anyone in. Then how? We figure it out. Together? Same way we figured everything else. Clara stood there, her hand still in his. Her face wet with fresh tears she probably didn't even notice. The sun was fully up now, warming the air, burning off the last of the night's chill. The world around them was waking up, birds singing, wind moving through the pines. the distant lowing of cattle from some ranch in the valley below. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for something doubt, maybe, or pity, or the same dismissal she'd seen so many times before. She didn't find it. "The women in town," she said slowly. "They'll keep talking. Let them. Some things are worth hard." Clara's breath came out in a shudder. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something in between. Her hand turned in his grip, palm up, fingers threading through his, holding on. The ride back was different. They'd retrieved her carpet bag from the roadside. Silas had picked it up before she could reach for it, strapped it to the back of the horse, without comment. Then he'd helped her mount, his hand steady at her waist, and swung up behind her. The horse carried them both up the mountain road, moving at an easy walk now that the urgency had drained away. Clara sat in front, Silas's arms around her to hold the reins, his chest warm against her back. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was different from any silence they'd shared before. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need words. It wasn't the heavy absence of the night before, when she'd packed her bag and convinced herself she was doing the right thing. This was something else, something new. The silence of two people who had finally said what needed saying and were resting in the aftermath. Silas's hand moved from the reins, just for a moment. It covered hers where it rested on the saddle horn, warm, rough, deliberate. A squeeze, then back to the reins. Clara didn't say anything. Didn't need to. She leaned back, just slightly, letting her weight settle against him. The cabin appeared over the final ridge. She'd seen it dozens of times now, had walked out this door every morning, looked at it from the garden, watched it from the fence while the cattle grazed. But today, it looked different. The curtains she'd hung caught the morning light, white against the weathered logs. The herb garden was green and thriving by the kitchen door. Smoke still rose from the chimney, thin and fading the fire she'd banked last night, finally dying down. Home. The word didn't taste bitter anymore. Silas dismounted first, then helped her down. His hands lingered at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not a question, not a promise, just recognition. An acknowledgement of what had changed. "I'll see to the horse," he said. Clara nodded. Walked to the cabin, pushed open the door. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. The note still sat on the table, crumpled where Silas had grabbed it in the dark hours of the morning. The spoon lay beside it, pale wood against the dark grain of the table. Clara picked up the note first. Read her own words, written in the depths of her despair. "I have nothing to give that wasn't already owed for wages. Thank you for the..." She folded it once, twice, then crossed to the stove and fed it to the embers. The paper caught, flared orange, curled into ash. She watched it burn until there was nothing left. Then she picked up the spoon. It was cool now. The residual warmth of the stove long faded. But when she closed her hand around the handle, it fit her palm like it had been carved for her grip alone, because it had. She opened the drawer. The other utensils lay jumbled inside mismatched tin forks, wooden spoons worn thin from years of use, the ladle with the bent handle nobody had ever fixed. She placed the carved spoon among them. It belonged. She started breakfast. The motions were automatic now. Stoke the fire. Put coffee on. Crack eggs into the pan. The kitchen filled with familiar sounds, familiar smells, steam rising, fat sizzling, the particular warmth of a room coming alive again. By the time Silas came in from the barn, the table was set. Eggs, biscuits, salt pork fried crisp. Coffee strong enough to strip paint, just the way he liked it. He hung up his hat, sat down in his usual place, looked at the food, then at her. "Thank you," he said. Clara nodded. Sat down across from him. They ate in their familiar silence. But it felt different now, fuller somehow. Richer. Like a cup that had been half empty for years was finally starting to fill. When the meal was done, Clara washed the dishes. Silas went to check on the cattle. The morning passed in the rhythm they'd built together, ordinary tasks, quiet companionship, the easy back and forth of two people who knew each other's movements without needing to think. Around midday, hoofbeats sounded on the road. Clara looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. Through the window, she could see Cobb riding into the clearing, his red beard bright against the blue sky. Silas met him in the yard. They talked for a few minutes. Clara could see them through the window. Two men in work clothes, gesturing toward the lower pasture. Then Cobb glanced toward the cabin. His eyes found the window, found Clara standing at the counter, flour on her hands. He didn't wave, didn't call out a greeting, just looked for a moment. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or understanding. Then he turned back to Silas. Whatever he said made Silas's shoulders shift. Not tension this time. Something else. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Cobb rode off a few minutes later. Silas stood in the yard, watching him go. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. The afternoon stretched out, long and golden. Clara finished her bread, put it in the oven, cleaned the kitchen. She walked out to the herb garden, pulled a few weeds, checked the progress of the mint she'd transplanted from the creek. By the time the sun started sinking toward the mountains, the bread was cooling on the counter, filling the cabin with its warm yeast smell. Clara had started dinner stew with the last of the venison, vegetables from her organized cellar. She was stirring the pot when she heard Silas's boots on the porch. He came in slowly. Didn't go straight to his chair by the fire like he usually did. Instead, he stopped in the doorway, between the main room and the kitchen, watching her work. Clara felt his eyes on her back, kept stirring. "Been thinking," he said. She didn't turn around. "About what? The cabin?" A pause. "It's small, built for one, maybe two, if they don't mind being close." Clara's spoon slowed in the pot. "It's fine for now." For now. He shifted his weight. She could hear the floorboard creak under his boots. Thought about adding a room. Off the back. Proper bedroom. Not that little space you've got. Window facing the mountains. Enough room for a real bed. Maybe a chair. For reading or sewing or whatever you'd want. Clara's hand stopped. "If you wanted to stay?" Silas continued. His voice was rough, uncertain, a man unaccustomed to saying things like this, pushing through anyway. Permanent life. The word hung in the air between them. Permanent. Clara set down the spoon, turned to face him. He was standing in the doorway, framed by the late afternoon light coming through the window behind him. His hands hung at his sides, fingers opening and closing the way they did when he was nervous. His face was hard to read, hope and fear and something else all tangled together. "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know." Clara crossed the kitchen. 3 steps. 4. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the individual strands of gray in his beard. the small lines around his eyes. She didn't say anything. Instead, she reached up. Her flour-dusted hand touched his cheek. His beard was rough under her palm. Warm from the day's sun, he went still. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she let her hand drop, turned, and walked past him into the main room. She could feel him watching her, could feel the weight of his confusion, his uncertainty. She walked to the counter by the window. The flour bin was there, the sourdough starter in its crock, all the ingredients she needed for tomorrow's bread. She measured flour into the bowl, added water, a pinch of salt, the starter, sour and alive. She began to knead. Silas appeared in the doorway, watching her work the dough. Push and Clara. She looked up. Eyes. "You're making bread," he said slowly. "For tomorrow." She nodded. Understanding dawned across his face. Slow, certain. The tension in his shoulders released. All at once, like a rope cut free, she was making bread for tomorrow. She was staying. A smile touched his mouth. Small and tentative at first, then growing. The first real smile she'd seen on his face since the day she'd arrived. He crossed the room, stood beside her at the counter, reached out, and covered her flour-dusted hand with his own. They stood like that for a long moment, the dough between them, the last light of day coming through the curtained window, the mountains turning gold and rose beyond. Clara kept kneading. Silas kept his hand on hers. Neither spoke. Outside, the first stars were appearing over the ridge. The cattle lowed softly in the distant pasture. Somewhere in the trees, a bird was singing its evening song. The bread dough rose beneath Clara's hands, warm and alive. She wasn't going anywhere. There is something tender about the moment when a person decides to stop running. Not the grand arrival, not the final destination. Just the quiet decision to stay, to trust that this place, these people, this life might be worth the risk of hoping. Many of us have known that feeling, the voice that whispers, we are too much or not enough, the fear that belonging is something meant for others, never for us. Perhaps you have heard those voices too. It is all right to have wondered. It is all right to have run. Some of us need to leave before we can understand what staying means. And perhaps, like Clara, we are allowed to rest now, to set down the bag, to knead the bread for tomorrow, and trust that tomorrow will come. Thank you for listening. We are grateful you were here.